Okay, let's do Ironeye today. Ironeye is a fantastic character, but I think he's even better than most people realized. And I'm going to show you a few extra tips and strategies today that I use when I'm playing with him. And first and foremost, you just saw it right there, shoot enemies in the face. These giants will flinch when you shoot them in the face. It gives you a few extra seconds to deal with them. Shooting them in the face also will do extra damage, extra stance damage, and it'll help you get them on the ground a little bit quicker. So these are the Madness Giants that you see at the Madness camps. But keep this in mind when you go for the central castles, because a lot of times there'll be giants there, trolls actually, they're technically called. So there'll be trolls at the central castle throwing their big pots. They're a little bit of a pain to deal with. Shooting them in the face is an ideal way to stagger them and just make them a lot easier to wipe out really quickly. Here's a second tip for you, and then I'll get back to shooting enemies. But that second tip there was that Ironeye can absolutely crit. So you can crit with the bow. They added a crit animation. I've seen people, just not take crits, and I assume that they just don't know that they can do that. So you can crit, you can do the, jump on the flame chariot head thing, and it works totally fine. So let's get back to shooting with the bow, though. Aiming down the sights is an incredibly useful tool, and if you're like me, it's something that you just didn't really do much during Elden Ring, and probably something you didn't really do much for the first few matches where you played as Ironeye. Typically, you just lock on and that's good enough, but then you start to realize that there's situations where aiming down the sights is great. So this is one of them, killing those who live in death. So you lose the ability to lock onto them after you put them in that downed state. You just need to hit them with one arrow each to finish them off. Once you get to that point, the damage doesn't matter. One damage is literally fine. So, damage drop off doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how far away you are. Just, start sniping those little glowing spots and you're going to finish those enemies off. It's really useful. Here's another enemy where you're going to want to aim down the sights. So this enemy doesn't have a natural lock-on spot in the head, but he still does take extra headshot damage and extra stance damage from headshots. I believe it's 50% for most enemies. Here's an enemy, again, that does have a natural lock-on on the head, so you don't need to aim down the sights fighting these flying dragons, but I just want to make a point that you should absolutely be aiming for the head, especially for these types of enemies. But whenever you can, if there's multiple lock-on points, make sure you've always got it locked onto the head if there is a point on the head. And that'll allow you to do 50% more damage per shot. You're effectively upping your DPS by 50%, actually more than that, because you're going to get more staggers, and the more staggers you get, the higher your DPS will be as well. Now let's quickly talk about melee weapons and FP, actually, because Ironeye, he doesn't have a huge amount of FP like Revenant, but he has all this FP, and you're not going to use the majority of it through like Mighty Shot and Barrage and Rain of Arrows, right? So pick something with a nice weapon art. Even if, maybe you find a weapon, the passive skill on it is not really that great, but it's, it's something like this, the Dragon King's Cragblade, where it has an absolute banger of a weapon art. You're not going to use that FP otherwise, so you might as well take advantage of it somehow, right? Here's another instance where you might want to use a melee weapon. So these guys really turtle up behind their shield. It's a little bit of a pain to deal with them with the bow. You can see I can use the marking skill to get some damage on them, get behind them, but as soon as I pull out this Monk's Flame Blade, this enemy becomes significantly easier to deal with. So, I mean, don't trap yourself in a box. You don't have to kill every single enemy with just the bow. You can totally use a melee weapon, and it can actually be really effective with Ironeye. Okay, let's talk about the ult really quickly. You just saw it there. And this is the boss that this ult is pretty much tailor-made for. So what you want to do is aim for whatever enemy is kind of in the dead center of the group. You fire this arrow that's surrounded by this big like air burst, and the air burst actually does the same amount of damage as the arrow. So it doesn't really matter who you hit directly, you're going to do the same amount of damage to everybody. So just aim for the middle to make sure that you kind of hit the entire group. There is one exception to this rule, and it's when you're using the relic that does poison buildup when you use a fully charged ult. Now, only the enemy that gets hit directly with the arrow is actually going to get poisoned. All the enemies with the air whoosh, or that get hit by the air whoosh, sorry, they are not going to get poisoned. So just keep that in mind. If there's a boss among the group, you probably do want to aim for the boss. If it's just a big group of mobs that you're trying to clear, then just aim for the middle. Now, there's one other important thing to know for when you use the ultimate ability, and that's that you that you should be marking the enemy every time before you use the ult. So let's talk about the marking skill a little bit. So you do this dash forward, you do like a slash with a dagger. It does some damage, but mainly just marks the enemy. It's also a very, very good dodging tool. And in fact, I have the relic that allows me to use the mark twice, and that allows you to kind of use it much more effectively as a dodging tool because it's going to be cooled down more, reliably for you, right? Now, when you mark an enemy, they take 10% more damage. However, they're going to take double damage from the ultimate if they're marked. So very important to mark enemies before you hit them with the ultimate because you're going to get a lot more value out of it that way. Okay, now this next thing, I'm actually pretty excited to show you this because I was pretty excited to realize this. So there are some skills that you get, such as the Deluge of Stars while walking, there's the Red Lightning, the Savage Flames, and a bunch of other while walking based skills. Now, these things don't really trigger in the most natural sense because you have to be going much slower than the base walking distance. Like, you basically have to be like edge walking in order to trigger this. However, most of the Nightfarers have a way to trigger this more naturally, and with Ironeye, it's holding the aim down the sights button. As you just saw there, we triggered the Wraiths while walking and the Deluge of Stars. Now, the Wraiths while walking, you can only find this on weapons. You can't find this on a passive ability from defeating a boss or something like that. So you'll have to put it in an offhand if you want to use it like this. But the Wraiths while walking, I would say, is the best while walking skill just because the amount of damage it does. It does kind of block your view a little bit, which isn't ideal, but it just triggers so often. It does a lot of damage, especially to enemies that are weak against Holy. So would highly recommend stacking the while walking skills. Even if you just aim down the sights for 1 second here and there, just to quickly trigger those little bursts of spells or lightning or whichever ones you find, right? But it's a very strong tool. And then when you combine that with what I showed you at the beginning of the video about enemies taking a lot more damage from headshots and certain enemies you kind of need to aim down the sights in order to hit them, it becomes a very, very powerful tool. So please keep in mind the while walking skills. Here's another quick tip for you. Just remember that you can use the marking skill while you're in the air. So right there, I used it to just kind of land like one level higher up than I would have landed, right? So it maybe saved me a couple of seconds. But in certain situations, you can use that. If you're just barely going to miss a ledge, you're like, oh no, I'm going to fall down into the gorge there, and then I'm going to have to find a spirit spring to jump back up. Well, this mark might actually bridge that gap for you and just kind of save you like 30 seconds in certain situations. It's also really fun to do. It's just really satisfying when it actually does work out and you end up feeling like, hey, I actually saved a decent amount of time there. Okay, so let's talk about prioritizing targets a little bit. So with Ironeye, I think a lot of times what will happen, especially that Crucible Knight and Hippopotamus duo fight that you just saw, most people just kind of go for whoever's closer, whoever's aggro to them, but you really want to work to get the matchup that works for you with Ironeye, right? So against that duo boss fight, you want to be fighting the Hippo. You don't want to be fighting the Crucible Knight because all of your shots are going to land on the Hippo. The Hippo is an enemy that you want to keep your distance to anyways, whereas the Crucible Knight, you're going to actually have to stick in close to him and essentially fight him like, pretending your bow is a melee weapon. You're going to have to be doing like rolling attacks and different things like that after he does his own attacks and drops his shield for a second. So here's a fight actually where target prioritization can be a huge help to the team. And this is the Sentient Pest fight. This is the Evergaol version of the fight. And when the Moth and the, I don't know, the Centipede or whatever it is, but the big monster thing, when they're both out at the same time, what you want is you want to be fighting the Moth, right? You want to be fighting the Moth while your two teammates are fighting the big guy. So the Moth is like, he's kind of difficult. I mean, his attacks are very easy to avoid and all of that, but it's just a pain that you can't really hit him much. Ironeye is one of 2 or 3 characters that can actually hit him consistently, and you don't have to worry about refilling your FP or anything like that like you do with the mage characters, right? The magic characters. So you're able to just consistently hit that Moth, and that's the matchup that you want, right? So just keep that in mind. Go for the matchups that suit you, and just try to think about what are the enemies that I can hit that my allies can't hit. So like Winged Misbegotten, for an example, bats, harpies, anything like that that likes to stay, 1 or 2 feet out of range so that your allies aren't able to hit them with the jump attacks. is, they're going to be trying to hit him with the jump attacks. They're going to be whiffing. It's going to be this whole mess. So, just ground them, pound them, get them out of there, and protect your teammates, right? That's what it's all about. So that's basically what I have for you today in terms of the tips and strategies that I use for Ironeye. I find this to be an incredible character. I'll say so far my two favorite characters are Guardian and Ironeye. I just find them to be incredibly unique. I don't know if those are the best characters, but those are my favorite characters. And I'd love to hear who you guys like the most and why. And I hope you learned something about Ironeye today. Actually, there's one last little tip for you. You can redirect your marking skills, so you can use that to kind of get out of harm's way and position yourself. But if you have any good tips, drop them in the comments. I'm sure people will love that. But otherwise, thanks for watching.